The courtroom was silent, breathless, until a soft voice echoed from the witness stand. "I saw everything, and it wasn't him." A 7-year-old girl had just pointed her finger and shattered everything the prosecution had built. When a respected schoolteacher is found murdered in her apartment, the case seems open and shut. Her estranged husband, a man with a known temper and a motive, is arrested within 24 hours. All evidence points to him, until his own daughter is called to the stand. What begins as a straightforward trial quickly descends into a maze of lies, suppressed truths, and a chilling revelation that no one saw coming. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the body of Roshni Mehta, a well-known schoolteacher in her community, was discovered in her upscale apartment in South Mumbai. The building's watchman, startled by the loud cries of a child from the flat, called the police. Inside, officers found Roshni lying face down on the living room floor, a pool of blood spreading beneath her head. Her 7-year-old daughter, Meher, was found hiding in the wardrobe, clutching a toy rabbit, trembling and silent. The apartment was in disarray. A flower vase lay shattered, curtains were torn, and a framed photo of Roshni and her husband, Arjun Mehta, was broken on the floor, the glass smeared with blood. The investigators' attention turned almost instantly to Arjun. Roshni and Arjun had been separated for nearly a year, though they were not officially divorced. Neighbors described frequent shouting matches whenever Arjun came to visit. The building's CCTV footage revealed that Arjun had been at the apartment late the previous night. A neighbor even claimed to have heard yelling around 11:30 p.m., followed by a loud crash. By the time Arjun was picked up for questioning the next morning, the media had already begun to spin the narrative. Jealous husband murders wife in front of child. Arjun, bewildered, denied any involvement. He admitted that he had visited Roshni the night before to discuss Meher's custody, but claimed he left before midnight and that she was alive when he left. He said they argued, yes, but he would never hurt her. The police weren't buying it. The forensic team confirmed that Roshni had died between midnight and 1 a.m. There were signs of blunt force trauma to her skull and bruises on her arms, consistent with a physical struggle. Her phone was smashed. No signs of forced entry were found, which further supported the theory that the killer was someone she knew and let in. All this, combined with Arjun's known history of short temper and past domestic violence complaint from Roshni, made him the perfect suspect. To the prosecution, it was a textbook case. A crime of passion, a man scorned, a child witness too young to testify. Open and shut. The arrest was made within 24 hours. Arjun's face flashed across every TV screen. Old photos of him with a furrowed brow and stern look were used repeatedly to shape public opinion. By the time the case reached court, even casual observers had made up their minds. To the world, Arjun was a murderer. He had motive, means, and opportunity. He had no alibi. He had a temper. The courtroom was just a formality. But there were details that didn't quite fit. The murder weapon, a heavy decorative paperweight, was found wiped clean of fingerprints. There was no blood on Arjun's clothes, shoes, or car. His phone records placed him back at his own apartment by 12:15 a.m., according to both his phone GPS and apartment building entry logs. Still, the police argued he could have committed the murder just before leaving. The biggest question, however, remained unanswered. What had Meher seen? She hadn't spoken since the incident. Not to the police, not to her relatives, not even to the court-appointed child psychologist. The trauma, doctor said, might take months or years to unlock. Without her testimony, her presence remained only as a shadow in the story. A detail to heighten the emotional weight of the crime, but not yet a voice. Behind bars, Arjun's mental condition deteriorated. He stopped eating, refused visitors, and became withdrawn. He swore on his life that he hadn't killed Roshni, but no one wanted to hear it. His lawyer, advocate Samir Qureshi, faced enormous pressure. The prosecution had prepared a solid timeline. Public sympathy was firmly on the victim's side. Arjun's image was ruined beyond repair. Still, something about the ease of the case gnawed at Samir. Crimes of passion were rarely this clean. The lack of prints on the murder weapon, the missing blood spatter on the suspect, and the smashed phone all seemed too deliberate. Like someone wanted it to look messy, emotional, reactive. But in reality, it was too tidy, too convincing. Almost staged. The defense had only one hope: Meher. Samir knew that if anyone could change the course of this trial, it was the silent little girl who saw something no one else had. But she hadn't spoken in over 3 weeks, and court rules made it difficult to bring a child that young to testify without traumatizing her further. Still, he prepared for that possibility. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy grew. Talk shows debated whether children should be allowed to testify. Family friends gave interviews about how Arjun always had a dark side. The court dates loomed, and Meher, silent and small, held the one truth that could either condemn her father forever or expose the real killer still out there. The trial began under a cloud of certainty. Certainty that Arjun Mehta was guilty. From the moment the prosecution laid out its opening statements, the courtroom felt like a stage with a pre-written ending. The public gallery was packed. Journalists filled the back rows. Every glance, every whisper carried judgment. To the world, Arjun wasn't on trial. He was just waiting for his sentence. Prosecutor Reena Doshi was sharp, confident, and meticulous. She painted Arjun as a controlling, possessive man who had never accepted the fact that Roshni had moved on. She spoke of the previous police complaint Roshni had filed, referencing emotional abuse and erratic behavior. She reminded the jury of the bruises found on Roshni's arms and the broken decor scattered across the apartment floor. It all pointed, she said, to a violent outburst, a final confrontation that turned deadly. She then presented the forensic report. The cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. The time of death: between 12 o'clock and 1 a.m. The murder weapon: a paperweight heavy enough to fracture a skull with one blow. Fingerprints: none. Blood spatter: controlled, indicating that the weapon was used with direct, precise force, not random rage. Then came the circumstantial evidence. Security footage showed Arjun arriving at Roshni's building at 10:51 p.m. He stayed for just over an hour. No other visitors were seen entering or exiting the building during that time. The CCTV at the back entrance, however, had been non-functional for weeks, a fact the prosecution used to imply that Arjun could have exited unseen. His phone GPS showed he returned to his home by 12:15 a.m. The timing was just close enough to cast suspicion, but not solid enough to provide an alibi. The neighbor's testimony followed. "I heard them arguing. I heard something crash. Then it went quiet," said the woman from the adjacent flat. It was like the silence after a storm. The courtroom was locked in. Each witness seemed to drive another nail into Arjun's fate. And then there was the photo. The broken frame with their family picture, stained with blood. The prosecution displayed it like a trophy. "Symbolic," Reena said dramatically. "This isn't just evidence. It's a story. A man who shattered the life he once framed as perfect." Arjun sat still throughout, pale and haunted. His lawyer, Samir Qureshi, had expected a challenge, but not a massacre. Every objection he raised was overruled. Every counterpoint he made was quickly drowned by the weight of evidence and the power of public perception. In private, he told Arjun, "They've got more than just evidence. They've got emotion on their side. That's dangerous." But Arjun didn't flinch. "I didn't kill her," he whispered again. "You have to believe me." Samir did. But belief wasn't enough in a courtroom. In the second week of the trial, Rena dropped her bombshell. A voice note recovered from Roshni's cloud account. It was dated 2 nights before her murder. "I don't feel safe anymore. He was here again. He says he won't leave without Meher. I'm scared he might do something stupid." It was damning. The jury looked shaken. Samir knew the note was emotionally loaded and possibly taken out of context, but the damage was done. Rena looked across the courtroom and delivered her final line before resting her case. "We do not need to guess. We do not need to speculate. This was not a robbery. This was not a stranger. This was not an accident. This was murder. Premeditated, personal, and performed by the man sitting right there." All eyes turned to Arjun. Samir stood to begin the defense portion of the trial with a dry throat and a tired heart. He had to fight a mountain of evidence, a courtroom filled with bias, and a child who had not said a single word since the tragedy. He began with what he could: the lack of physical evidence directly tying Arjun to the murder weapon. No blood on his clothes, no fingerprints, no skin fragments under Roshni's fingernails. He reminded the jury that the scene could have been staged. He questioned why. If Arjun was so emotional and impulsive, the crime scene looked disturbingly calculated. But it wasn't enough. The jury remained cold. They nodded politely, but they weren't moved. The narrative had already been set. The pieces fit too perfectly, and Samir had no witness strong enough to knock them out of place. Until one evening, after court had adjourned, Samir received a call from the child psychologist working with Meher. "She said something today," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "It wasn't much, but I think it could change everything." Hope flickered. Samir pressed further. "What did she say?" "She said, that man wasn't my papa. He was wearing all black. He hurt Mummy." Samir froze. After weeks of silence, Meher had spoken. The defense suddenly had a reason to fight. A voice too small for most to notice, but loud enough to shatter an entire courtroom. Courtrooms are built on words, facts, arguments, cross-examinations. But on the morning of day 12 in the case of the state versus Arjun Mehta, the most powerful voice was expected to come from someone who barely understood the weight of the word testify. Meher Mehta, age 7, witness, key, condition, fragile. The decision to bring her to the stand had been controversial. Psychologists warned against the emotional toll. Prosecutors called it a stunt, but advocate Samir Qureshi had no choice left. The prosecution had created a perfect storm of evidence, emotion, and motive. The jury had almost made up its mind. Only the truth, raw, unfiltered, and possibly from the only person who saw what really happened, could pierce through that fog. The courtroom was unusually silent that morning. The usual murmur of lawyers, reporters, and restless spectators was replaced by something more reverent, more tense. Everyone knew what was coming. The accused daughter was about to speak. Meher entered slowly, clutching her worn-out rabbit toy, her tiny fingers gripping its ear like a lifeline. Her eyes scanned the room, not for people, but for safety. She didn't meet her father's eyes. Arjun, sitting at the defense table, fought back tears as he watched her walk up, barely taller than the chair she was helped onto. The judge leaned forward, voice unusually soft. "Meher, do you know why you're here today?" She nodded slowly. "To tell the truth," she whispered. Samir approached the stand carefully. No legal jargon, no formal cross-examination, just a conversation, a bridge. "Meher," he said gently, "do you remember that night when Mummy got hurt?" She nodded again, quieter this time. The courtroom leaned in. "Can you tell us what you saw?" She looked at her toy for a long time. Then her voice, thin as paper, rose. "I was in my room. Mummy was shouting. Not at Papa. At someone else. A man." "A man?" Samir repeated, "Was your papa there?" She shook her head. "No, he came later." He screamed and cried when he saw Mummy. Gasps swept across the gallery. The prosecution immediately objected. Hearsay, coach testimony. But the judge allowed it. "Let her speak," he said firmly. Samir continued carefully, aware of the fragile thread holding this moment together. "Can you tell us what the man looked like?" Meher paused. Her voice dropped further. "He wore black. His hoodie was over his face. I saw his eyes. They were very angry." Samir showed her a set of sketches. 5 drawn faces, one of them resembling the alternate suspect Reena had dismissed early in the investigation. Roshni's colleague Vikrant Seth, who had once been investigated for stalking, but was cleared due to lack of evidence. Meher pointed slowly to sketch number 3. "That one," she said, with surprising clarity. "He came before. Mummy told him to leave. He came back that night. Chaos broke loose. Reporters scrambled. Reena stood up shouting, but the judge pounded the gavel for order. The jury looked stunned, their tightly held narrative suddenly cracking. Reena tried to shake Meher's account in cross-examination. "Sweetheart, is it possible you were confused? Maybe scared? Maybe you thought you saw something that wasn't real?" Meher's answer, simple and terrifying, brought the room to a standstill. "I remember his smell. He smelled like Mummy's office. Papa smells like mint and smoke. This man smelled like printer ink and tea." Even the judge blinked at that. It was a child's sensory memory, honest, unscripted, and unshakable. The prosecution's case didn't collapse instantly, but its foundation began to crack. The previously dismissed alternate suspect, Vikrant, was suddenly very relevant. A quick subpoena revealed emails Roshni had sent to the school principal weeks before her death, complaining of Vikrant's behavior. He had been reprimanded, but never reported to the authorities. Even worse, a hoodie matching Meher's description was found in the school's storage room, with traces of blood later confirmed to be Roshni's. Samir leaned forward during a recess and said quietly to Arjun, "Your daughter just did what no one else could. She made them listen." When court resumed, Reena tried to recover. She argued that childhood memory was unreliable, that Meher had been traumatized, maybe manipulated. But the jury had heard her voice. The judge had seen her trembling hands. Her innocence made her account too pure to dismiss. By the end of the day, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. For the first time, Arjun didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a father, one caught in a nightmare built on silence, now finally cracking open with the truth. With Meher's testimony echoing through the halls of justice, the defense had gained the one thing it had sorely lacked since day one: momentum. Suddenly, the idea that someone else could have murdered Roshni Mehta wasn't just plausible, it was unavoidable. The spotlight turned to Vikrant Seth, the once dismissed co-worker whose name had barely made it into the early investigation notes. The prosecution had brushed him off early, claiming his past infatuation with Roshni was harmless, resolved, and irrelevant. But now, with Meher directly identifying him and fresh evidence surfacing, the defense had enough to demand a deeper inquiry. And what unfolded next was nothing short of chilling. Advocate Samir Qureshi immediately filed a motion for further forensic examination on the hoodie recovered from the school's storage room. The tests came back within 72 hours. Not only did it contain traces of Roshni's blood, it had tiny fibers matching the rug in her apartment. Even more damning, partial DNA under the hood's inner collar that did not belong to Arjun, but matched Vikrant's employee record sample submitted years earlier for a school background check. Reena Doshi, the once confident prosecutor, now found herself retreating. She insisted the evidence was circumstantial, the hoodie could have been stolen or planted, and that the investigation should not be derailed by a child's uncorroborated account. But the jury had already seen a different truth, spoken not by the accused, but by a child with no reason to lie. Samir dug deeper. Through a subpoena, he acquired email transcripts and internal school memos that painted a very different picture of Vikrant's relationship with Roshni. She had reported him 3 times over the past 8 months. First, for leaving flowers and anonymous poems in her staff mailbox. Second, for waiting outside the school after hours. And third, just 2 weeks before her death, for showing up uninvited at a parent-teacher meeting pretending to be Meher's father. Each time, the school issued informal warnings, asking Vikrant to maintain professional boundaries. But no report was ever filed with the police. There was no escalation, no action, just silence. Samir didn't stop there. He tracked down a former school secretary who had since moved to another city, Anjali Nair. She agreed to testify via video call. Her testimony was critical. Roshni was terrified, Anjali said, her face somber on the courtroom screen. She told me Vikrant had a temper, that he once grabbed her arm during an argument in the staff room. She was scared of retaliation. She said if anything ever happened to her, Vikrant would be the one to look at. The courtroom sat frozen. Even the judge leaned back, hands folded in front of his mouth, staring at the screen. Samir ended his questioning with a single sentence. "Why didn't you come forward earlier?" "I was afraid," Anjali admitted. "We all were. No one took her seriously until now." Meanwhile, Vikrant was brought in for questioning by the police, and his demeanor raised further concerns. Initially calm and composed, he broke down under pressure. When presented with Meher's testimony and the forensic report, he demanded a lawyer and refused to speak. A classic move, but a damning one in the eyes of a jury already swaying. Then came the bombshell. Digital forensics experts traced an anonymous email account that had been used to send threatening messages to Roshni's personal email. Messages she never shared with her family or Arjun. The IP address was linked to a device on the school's Wi-Fi network. The language matched phrases Vikrant had used in text messages found during the investigation. The tone was obsessive angry and filled with veiled threats. "You think you can ignore me? I see everything, even when you think you're alone." The same phrase was echoed in Meher's offhand remark during therapy. He said he sees everything, like a ghost. That's what Mummy said. It was no longer theory. It was a pattern. A man obsessed. A woman afraid. A system that failed to act. And a child who remembered more than anyone thought possible. The jury had been asked to believe that Arjun Mehta, a flawed but loving father, murdered his wife in a moment of rage. But what they saw now was different. They saw institutional neglect. They saw suppressed complaints, ignored red flags, and a man, Vikrant, who had slipped through the cracks until a child spoke the truth. Samir ended his defense with a quote from Roshni's final diary entry, recovered from her laptop. "If anything happens to me, I just hope Meher is safe. I hope someone believes her." Now, someone had. The courtroom felt different on the final day. Gone was the smug certainty that had once hovered over the prosecution's case. In its place was unease, an uncomfortable awareness that the truth might have always been in front of them, quietly ignored. Vikrant Seth had been called to the stand. For weeks, he had remained in the shadows, dismissed as a minor character in a tragedy that had already chosen its villain. But now, with forensic links, eyewitness testimony, and a history of obsessive behavior exposed, he was no longer invisible. He was the eye of the storm. As he took the stand, Vikrant looked calm. Too calm. His neatly pressed shirt, composed tone, and calculated pauses gave off an air of control. But advocate Samir Qureshi knew better. He knew control often masked fear, and he was about to strip it away, piece by piece. He began gently. "Mr. Seth, You worked with Roshni Mehta for how long? 3 years, Vikrant replied. We taught in the same department. And during those 3 years, did you maintain a professional relationship? Yes. No inappropriate advances? Vikrant's smile was slight. None. Samir nodded, flipping through a folder of documents. Then how do you explain this? He held up a printed email. One of the recovered threats sent anonymously to Roshni. Vikrant looked at it. I don't know what that is, but the IP address traces back to your computer. Your school-issued laptop. There are dozens of staff using that network. Anyone could have. The phrasing used here, I see everything, even when you think you're alone, is identical to a message you once wrote in a birthday card to Roshni. You signed it, the ghost who watches. Do you remember that? Silence. Vikrant's eyes twitched. Samir pushed further. Let's talk about the hoodie. I never owned a black hoodie. Yet your DNA was found on one matching Meher's description, located inside the school, where you had full access. Blood on the sleeve was matched to Roshni. The fibers matched her rug. Coincidence? I don't know. This is absurd. What's absurd? Samir interrupted, his voice rising. Is that Roshni Mehta reported you for harassment 3 times. That you showed up at a parent-teacher meeting pretending to be Meher's father. That you waited outside her house after being warned not to. And still, you want this court to believe you had nothing to do with her death. The jury leaned in. The room was utterly still. Reena Doshi, the prosecutor, sat with her head low. She had tried to discredit the defense's claims, but the sheer weight of new evidence made it impossible to refute. Her case was crumbling, not because it had no foundation, but because it had built its foundation on the wrong person. Vikrant's face began to change, his control slipping. He tugged at his collar, shifted in his seat. Samir leaned in one last time. Did you love her, Mr. Seth? The question hit harder than any accusation. For the first time, Vikrant didn't answer immediately. His voice cracked. I respected her. But she didn't love you back, did she? Silence. And when she rejected you, when she threatened to report you again, you went to her apartment that night, didn't you? I didn't. You did. You wore the hoodie. You waited until Arjun left. You slipped in through the back stairwell, the one with no camera. You fought with her. You hit her with the paperweight. You wiped it clean. You smashed her phone. You made it look like the husband did it. You thought Meher was too young to understand. But she remembered. Vikrant's hands trembled. You have no proof. But we do. And now, so does this court. Samir stepped back. The final blow had landed. There was no dramatic confession. No courtroom outburst. Just the slow, visible collapse of a man who thought he'd committed the perfect crime and been forgotten. The jury looked different now. Less confident, more cautious. And Arjun, the man who had been vilified, humiliated, and nearly condemned, sat quietly as his world turned. His eyes locked on his daughter, sitting in the front row. She gave a tiny nod. The truth had found its voice. The courtroom fell into an expectant silence as Judge Nandita Rao adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the room slowly. For days, this courtroom had been a battlefield, facts clashing with emotions, assumptions unraveling under truth. But now, the war had ended. It was time for judgment. She looked toward Arjun Mehta first, the man who had sat silently day after day, accused of killing the woman he once loved. Then she turned to the jury foreperson. Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? She asked. The woman stood, voice steady. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Arjun Mehta, not guilty. A breathless wave swept through the room. Arjun closed his eyes, tears silently falling down his cheeks. The silence was broken by a soft sob from Meher. She leapt from her seat, and within seconds, father and daughter were in each other's arms. Judge Rao tapped her gavel once. Not for order, but for attention. "This court would like to make a formal statement before adjournment," she said, voice firm. "The story presented before us was one of tragedy, yes, but also of tremendous failure. A failure not of one man, but of systems. Roshni Mehta tried to seek help multiple times. She raised concerns. She left signs, and those signs were ignored. We, as a society, failed her." Her voice hardened. "This court finds that Vikrant Seth is now the subject of an ongoing investigation based on new evidence. While due process must still follow, let it be stated that justice delayed for Roshni Mehta will no longer be justice denied." She turned her gaze back to Arjun. "To Mr. Arjun Mehta, you were vilified, labeled, and nearly condemned for a crime you did not commit. This court cannot restore what was taken from you. Your reputation, your peace, or the precious years of your daughter's life you spent proving your innocence. But it can say this clearly for all to hear. You are not a killer. You are a father who refused to be broken." Her voice softened finally. "And to Meher, the youngest voice in this courtroom, your courage has rewritten the truth. Never let anyone silence your story again." The gavel fell. Court is adjourned.